John Kennedy discovers his childhood friend is homeless. Next day he gets the shock of his life. John Neely Kennedy, U.S. Senator from Louisiana, gripped the wheel of his sleek black SUV as he cruised through the familiar streets of his hometown, the humid air carrying the scent of fresh-cut grass and nostalgia that tugged at his heart. Despite the whirlwind of Washington, D.C., endless meetings, speeches, and handshakes, these weathered streets, lined with small shops, faded graffiti, and a rusty basketball court, still felt like home. John was supposed to be heading to a high-stakes meeting with campaign donors, but something inexplicable like a whisper from his past had pulled him off course, guiding him down the narrow road toward Joey's Pizza. The sun was dipping low, painting the sky in vibrant shades of orange and purple, its glow reflecting off his windshield. Kids on the nearby basketball court shouted and laughed, their voices spilling through his open window, stirring memories of long-gone summers when he and his best friend David Thompson ruled that same court. David, with his infectious grin and natural talent, had always been the star, teaching John how to fake out opponents with a slick move they called the Thompson Special. John chuckled, his fingers tightening on the steering wheel, his mind drifting to those endless afternoons when two 12-year-old boys sat on the curb sharing a soda and swearing they'd conquer the NBA together. As he eased past Joey's Pizza, a figure caught his eye, a gaunt man in a tattered jacket rummaging through the dumpster out back, his shoulders hunched against the evening chill. John's first instinct was to look away. He'd seen homeless folks before and always tried to help when he could, but something about this man's movements stopped him cold. The way he shifted his weight quick and fluid, like a ball player ready to drive to the hoop, it was hauntingly familiar. "No way," John whispered, pulling the SUV to the curb. He squinted through the fading light, trying to make out the man's face hidden under a grimy baseball cap. The stance, the subtle sway, it was like watching a ghost from his childhood. "David?" The name slipped out before he could stop it. The man's head snapped up, and for a split second their eyes locked. Even in the dim light, John knew those eyes that once sparkled with mischief and unshakable belief in their shared dreams. It was David Thompson. Without a word, David bolted. John flung open the car door, not bothering to close it, his polished dress shoes slapping against the pavement as he gave chase. "David, wait! It's me, John!" he shouted, his voice echoing through the narrow alley behind the pizza joint. David darted through the shadows, knocking over trash cans to block John's path, the clatter of metal ringing out in the quiet evening. Though John was well into his 50s, he still had enough in him to keep up, driven by a mix of shock and determination. David burst onto Market Street, his breathing ragged, his steps faltering. He stumbled, catching himself against a lamppost, his chest heaving as he fought to stay upright. John slowed his pace, approaching cautiously, hands raised to show he meant no harm. Up close, the changes in his old friend were gut-wrenching. David's face was gaunt, his skin stretched tight over sharp cheekbones, his hair matted and filthy under the cap. A jagged scar ran down his right cheek, a mark John didn't recognize from their youth. His clothes were layers of torn fabric reeking of the streets, but his eyes, those were the same eyes that had lit up with pride when John sank his first real basket in a game. "David," John said, his voice thick with emotion, "what happened to you? We were going to take on the NBA together. Remember Kennedy and Thompson? Unstoppable." David let out a bitter laugh, his voice rough and barely audible. "Dreams don't always work out, John. You made it big. Senator, big shot. Me." He trailed off, wrapping his arms around his thin frame as if trying to disappear. John took a step closer, but David flinched, his eyes darting like a cornered animal's. "Don't, John. You shouldn't be here. You shouldn't see me like this." His voice cracked, laced with shame, and something deeper. something John couldn't quite place. John shook his head, keeping his tone steady. You taught me how to fake out defenders, David. You believed in me when no one else did. I'm not letting you run off again. He glanced around, spotting the neon glow of Wilson's diner a few blocks away, still open after all these years. Come on, let me buy you dinner. Wilson's is still there. You remember those chocolate milkshakes? 2 straws, like old times. David hesitated, his gaze sweeping the street as if searching for an escape. His hands clenched the frayed edges of his jacket, and for a moment, John thought he'd bolt again. I don't belong in places like that anymore, John, he muttered. You don't get it. But exhaustion seemed to win out, and after a long pause, he nodded, his voice barely a whisper. 1 meal. Then you leave me alone. Okay, John nodded, leading the way to Wilson's diner, where the familiar neon sign buzzed warmly. The bell above the door jingled as they stepped inside, just like it had when they were kids. A few patrons looked up, recognizing John Kennedy, whispering to each other, but their eyes slid past David as if he were invisible. They slid into a booth, their booth, the one they'd claimed as kids, where they'd spent hours plotting their future over milkshakes. John ordered a burger and fries, while David, his voice barely audible, asked for a bowl of soup and water. John smiled, adding, and a chocolate milkshake, 2 straws. The waitress, Betty, with the same kind smile John remembered from decades ago, nodded and walked off. When the milkshake arrived set between them, with 2 red and white straws poking out of the whipped cream. A ghost of a smile flickered across David's face, but it vanished quickly, replaced by a distant, haunted look. You shouldn't be here, John, he said, again tearing his paper napkin into tiny pieces. Not with someone like me. John leaned forward, his voice soft but firm. You taught me the Thompson Special D. You were the first person to believe I could be something. What happened to you? How did you end up here? David stared at his soup steam rising in faint curls. Life happened, he said, his voice hard. After I moved away, everything fell apart. My parents... He stopped, his hands trembling as he gripped the spoon. Car accident. They're gone. John's throat tightened. I didn't know, David. Why didn't you reach out? I could have helped. David's laugh was hollow. Help? You think you could have fixed what's broken? Some things can't be fixed, John. They ate in silence, the milkshake sitting untouched, condensation dripping onto the table. John watched his friend, noting the way David's eyes kept darting to the door, as if he might run at any moment. He saw the scar again, stark against David's weathered skin, and something about it gnawed at him, a story untold, a piece of the puzzle missing. That scar, John said gently. Where'd it come from? David's hand shot to his cheek, covering it instinctively. You don't want to know, John. Trust me. His tone was final, shutting down the question. The meal passed quietly, the weight of unspoken words heavy between them. John's mind raced with memories, David teaching him to fake left and drive right, the 2 of them laughing over milkshakes, signing a pact to become NBA stars. As they stood to leave, David swayed slightly, and John reached out to steady him, but David pulled back, his eyes flashing. I don't need help, John, he snapped, then softened. Thanks for the food. But you should go now. John shook his head. No way, David. It's going to rain tonight. Let me get you a hotel room, just for 1 night. David looked out at the darkening sky. Storm clouds gathering, and after a long moment, he nodded reluctantly. 1 night. That's it. They walked to a nearby hotel, the silence between them thick with tension. John booked a room, handing David the key card. As they stood outside the door, The hallway light caught David's face, highlighting the scar and the fear in his eyes. "Thanks, John," he mumbled, turning away. "I'll be gone by morning." John grabbed his arm gently. "I'm coming back tomorrow, David. We're gonna talk." David didn't respond, just slipped into the room and closed the door. John stood there, a sinking feeling in his gut. He knew David was hiding something bigger than poverty, bigger than grief. The scar, the way he flinched at every sudden move, the constant readiness to run it all pointed to a secret John was determined to uncover. As he rode the elevator down, the childhood pact tucked in his pocket felt heavier than ever. He wouldn't let David disappear again. Not this time. Whatever truth his friend was running from, John would find it no matter how painful it might be. The morning light filtered through the hotel room window, casting long shadows across the untouched bed where David Thompson should have been sleeping. John Neely Kennedy, U.S. Senator from Louisiana, stood in the doorway, his chest tight with a mix of frustration and dread. The room was empty, just as he'd feared. David had vanished again, leaving behind only a worn piece of notebook paper on the pillow, their childhood pact, written in blue ink, now yellowed and fragile. "We, John Kennedy and David Thompson, swear to become NBA superstars together. Best friends forever." John's fingers trembled as he picked it up, the words blurring through a haze of memories. Two boys on a basketball court, dreaming of glory, unaware of the cruel twists life had in store. He tucked the paper into his wallet, his jaw set with determination. He wasn't a kid anymore, and he wasn't about to let his friend slip through his fingers again. David was out there somewhere in the city, carrying a secret that had driven him to the streets, and John would find him. He pulled out his phone, canceling his day's meetings with a quick text to his assistant, "Family emergency. Clear my schedule." It wasn't a lie. David had been family once, closer than a brother, and John owed him this much. His first stop was Joey's Pizza, where he'd spotted David digging through the dumpster the night before. The morning crew was just setting up, and a young cook stacking boxes looked up wide-eyed at the sight of a U.S. Senator standing in the alley. "You looking for the guardian angel?" the cook asked, wiping his hands on his apron. John frowned. "Who?" The cook grinned. "That's what we call the guy who comes around here. Skinny fella, scar on his cheek. He makes sure the other homeless folks don't fight over the leftovers, splits the food fare. Real decent guy." John's heart sank. Even in his lowest moments, David was still looking out for others, just like he'd looked out for John on the court all those years ago. "When'd you last see him?" John asked. The cook shrugged. "Last night, round sunset. He don't come every day, though. Sometimes he's gone for weeks, especially when the weather turns bad." John thanked him and moved on, the image of David dividing scraps for others burning in his mind. Next, he headed to the local homeless shelter, a squat brick building with a line of people already forming outside. The woman at the front desk, her name tag reading Clara, recognized David from John's description immediately. "Mr. Thompson." "Oh, he's a regular helper around here," she said, flipping through a logbook. "Breaks up fights, talks to the young ones, just hitting the streets keeps 'em calm. But he never stays overnight. Says the beds should go to those who need 'em more." John leaned against the counter, stunned. "Any idea where I might find him?" Clara shook her head. "He keeps to himself mostly. But you could try Old Pete's Coffee Cart on Market Street. They're friendly." Joanne nodded, his mind racing. David, the kid who'd once dreamed of NBA stardom, was now a quiet hero to the city's forgotten, living in the shadows to help others survive. At Market Street, Old Pete's Coffee Cart was buzzing with morning commuters. Pete, a weathered man with kind eyes, lit up at the mention of David. "The professor, you mean? he said, pouring a cup for a customer. That's what I call him, on account of how he's always helping street kids with their homework. John blinked, caught off guard. Homework? Pete nodded, pointing to a stack of cardboard boxes behind his cart. Yup, sets up a little classroom right there. Yesterday morning he had 3 kids with him teaching 'em math. Bought 'em hot chocolate with what little cash he had. The image hit John like a punch. David, penniless and broken, spending his last dollars to keep kids in school. Where can I find him? John asked, his voice tight. Pete scratched his chin. Try the library, maybe. He takes the kids there when it rains. Or there's that spot under the Marshall Street Bridge. But be careful, Senator. The professor's got a good heart, but he spooks easy. Seen too much bad stuff, I reckon. The walk to Marshall Street Bridge took 20 minutes, the city waking up around John as he moved through its streets. Under the bridge, the ground was littered with makeshift shelters, cardboard tarps, anything to keep out the elements. At first, it looked deserted, but then John spotted a familiar figure in the shadows surrounded by 3 teenagers with backpacks and dog-eared textbooks. David was pointing at a math problem, his voice low and patient, the same tone he'd used when teaching John how to fake out defenders on the court. The kids listened intently, one nodding, as David explained a fraction. He looked exhausted, his scar stark against his pale skin, but there was a quiet strength in him, a flicker of the boy John once knew. One of the teens, a girl with braided hair, noticed John and gasped. David's head snapped up, their eyes locking. For a moment, neither moved, the air thick with unspoken history. Go on to school, David told the kids quietly. We'll finish this tomorrow. The teens gathered their books, shooting excited glances at John as they hurried off. The youngest, a boy clutching a math book, whispered, "Thanks, Professor," before disappearing up the embankment. David stood slowly, his body tense, ready to run. You shouldn't be here, John, he said, his voice rough. John held up the childhood pact, its edges worn thin. You left this behind. Kept it all these years, huh? David's eyes flicked to the paper, then away. Time to let old dreams die. John took a step closer. Is that what you're doing under this bridge? Letting dreams die. Looks to me like you're building them for those kids. David looked away, his hands shaking. Just trying to give them a fighting chance. Maybe they won't screw up like I did. John's voice softened. You don't have to keep running, David. Whatever happened, whatever you're carrying, we can face it together. David's laugh was bitter. You don't understand, John. You can't help me. Nobody can. His eyes darted to the shadows as if expecting something or someone to emerge. Before John could press further, David coughed a deep rattling sound that made him double over. His skin was clammy, his forehead burning when John touched it. You're sick, John said, alarmed. We're getting you to a hospital. David shook his head weakly. No hospitals. Can't afford it. But he was too weak to resist as John called his security team, who arrived with a car within minutes. At the hospital, doctors swarmed around David, hooking him up to an IV and running tests. John paced the hallway, the childhood packed heavy in his pocket. Finally, the head doctor emerged, her expression serious. He's severely malnourished and has pneumonia, she said, but there's something else. During our exam, we found a mass. It's not cancerous, benign, treatable with surgery, but he's refusing treatment. John's heart stopped. Why, the doctor sighed. He says he doesn't deserve to live. Maybe you can talk to him. Inside the room, David looked small against the white sheets, an IV dripping fluids into his arm. His eyes opened when John entered, and for the first time, he didn't try to run. Guess I messed up your plan to save me, he said weakly. John pulled a chair close. You're still breathing, aren't you? Plan's working fine so far. David's gaze drifted to the window. They found the mass, didn't they? Thought it was cancer. Thought it was my punishment. John leaned forward. Punishment for what David talked to me. David closed his eyes, his voice barely audible. You want the truth. Fine, but you won't look at me the same after this. John braced himself, sensing the weight of what was coming. Remember when my parents died? David's voice was distant, lost in memory. Everyone said it was a drunk driver hit him head on. But it wasn't some random guy, John. It was me. The words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. John felt his world tilt. I was 19. David continued, each word seeming to cost him. Just made the college basketball team's starting lineup. Went to a party to celebrate, thought I was okay to drive. I wasn't. Woke up in the hospital, and they told me my parents were gone. Because of me. Tears rolled down his hollow cheeks. The team covered it up, small-town big basketball program. Made it look like some unnamed drunk driver. Gave me a second chance. His laugh was bitter. But how do you live with that? Knowing you killed the people who loved you most. John's hands clenched, his mind reeling. David, I didn't know. David pulled his arm away, staring at the ceiling. That's not the worst of it, John. After that, I couldn't play, couldn't sleep. Started taking pills to get through games. 1 pill became 2, 2 became 10. Before I knew it, basketball was gone. Everything was gone. And then, he stopped, his hand drifting to the scar on his cheek. Then I did something worse. John's blood ran cold. What are you talking about? David's voice cracked. Your cousin James. The hit and run 15 years ago. That was me, too. The room spun. James, John's kind-hearted cousin, the one who worked with troubled kids, had died in a car crash. The driver never found. I was using again, David said, words tumbling out like a dam breaking. Bad batch, didn't know where I was. Woke up with this scar from the windshield and found out I'd killed your cousin. John stumbled back his chair, scraping against the floor. No, he whispered, shaking his head. No, it can't be. David's eyes were wet, his voice raw. I sold everything. I had sent the money to your family anonymously for the funeral. Thought maybe it'd help, but it didn't. I wanted to turn myself in, but I saw you at the funeral, heard you talk about James, how he helped kids stay off drugs, and I thought, maybe I could do that too. Not enough to make up for it, but something. John slid down the wall, his legs giving out. The anonymous donation, the one that had paid for James's funeral, he'd always wondered where it came from. Now he knew. David had been punishing himself for years, living on the streets, carrying this guilt alone. Why didn't you tell me last night? John asked, his voice hoarse. David's laugh was hollow. Hey, John, remember me? Your old buddy who taught you basketball and killed your cousin? Yeah, that'd go over great. He shook his head. Better you thought I was just some junkie who lost his way. John stared at his friend, the man who'd once been his hero, now a broken shell haunted by his mistakes. The hospital machines beeped softly, filling the silence. David spoke again, his voice faint. The surgery. I don't want it. Not after what I did to your family. John stood his mind, a storm of grief and loyalty. You don't get to decide that, David. Not yet. As a nurse came in to check David's vitals, John stepped into the hallway, the childhood pact burning a hole in his pocket. He had to decide what to do with the truth and with the friend who'd shattered his world. John Neely Kennedy sat in his SUV outside the police station, the hospital admission papers trembling in his hands, as the first light of dawn painted the Louisiana sky in hues of pink and gold. The documents held David Thompson's confession, his admission to the hit-and-run that killed John's cousin James 15 years ago, and the earlier accident that took his own parents' lives. One step through those station doors, and justice the kind written in law books would be served. But John's mind was a storm of memories. James, with his warm smile and unwavering belief in second chances, working tirelessly with troubled kids to steer them toward better paths. David, the boy who taught John how to fake out defenders on the basketball court, now a broken man who'd spent years atoning in the shadows. His phone buzzed a text from the hospital confirming David's surgery was set for noon, the doctors optimistic about removing the benign tumor. David would live unless John turned over the papers. He closed his eyes, whispering to the empty car. "What would you do, James?" As if in answer, another text arrived from his security team who'd been watching the Marshall Street Bridge as ordered. The attached photo showed 3 teenagers huddled there, clutching textbooks, looking lost. "The professor's kids," the message read. "Been waiting since dawn. Don't know he's in the hospital." John's grip tightened on the papers, his decision crystallizing. Justice, he realized, wasn't always found in courtrooms. He started the car and drove to the bridge, the morning air crisp against his face as he stepped out. The teenagers looked up, hope fading to disappointment when they saw it wasn't David. "The professor's sick," John said gently, crouching to their level. "He's in the hospital, but he's going to be okay." The youngest, a boy with a worn math book, clutched it tightly. "Is he going to die? He promised to help me pass my test Friday." John smiled, his heart aching. "No, he's not dying, but he might need some help when he's out. Think you guys could look after him for a change?" The kids nodded eagerly, and the oldest, a girl with braided hair, spoke up. Her voice soft. "He saved my life, you know. Found me trying to buy drugs right here. Talked me out of it. Told me his story, his whole story." John's eyes narrowed. "About his parents. The drugs. My cousin." She nodded, her gaze steady. "Said we needed to know what rock bottom really looks like. That's why he lives out here, to remind himself and stop us from going down his path." The papers in John's pocket felt heavier, but the weight of her words was heavier still. David had been carrying James's legacy, trying to save kids from the mistakes that had destroyed him. Back at the hospital, John found David being prepped for surgery, his friend's eyes resigned as he lay in the sterile bed. "You went to the police," David said, not a question but a statement, his voice flat with acceptance. John shook his head, pulling the admission papers from his pocket. "No, I went to the bridge." David's eyes flickered with something, hope maybe, or fear. "The kids, they okay?" John sat beside him. "They're worried about their professor. That girl, the oldest, she told me what you did for her, what you've done for all of them." David looked away, his hands twisting the hospital blanket. "Doesn't make up for James." John's voice was firm. "Nothing can bring him back. But this—" He held up the papers, then tore them into tiny pieces, letting them fall like confetti. "This isn't what James would have wanted." David's eyes widened, tears brimming. "What are you doing?" John met his gaze. "Choosing the kind of justice I believe in. James believed in redemption. So do I." David's shoulders shook with silent sobs. "How can you even look at me after what I did?" John leaned closer, his voice cracking. "Because I see 2 people when I look at you. The man who killed my cousin, and the man who spent 15 years trying to make it right. You've punished yourself enough, David, living on the streets helping those kids carrying this guilt. It's time to honor James by living again. David's voice was a whisper. I don't know how. John took his friend's trembling hand. Then, let me help you learn. Step by step, like you taught me that fake pass. A nurse entered to wheel David to surgery, but he grabbed John's hand one last time. Thank you, he whispered, for giving me a chance to make things right. John squeezed back. You already were, Dee. I just helped you see it. Hours later, the surgery was a success. David would recover, and John made calls to his youth center, arranging a small apartment, simple but clean, and a teaching position. A month later, David stood before his first official class. At the center, the kids from the bridge in the front row, their faces beaming with pride. On the wall hung 2 photos, one of James smiling brightly, and one of John and David as boys on the basketball court, practicing the Thompson Special. As David began his lesson, not just on math, but on choices, consequences, and the long road to redemption. John watched from the doorway, a quiet peace settling in his chest. Justice, he realized, wasn't about punishment, but about transformation. David had punished himself for years, but now he was carrying on James's work, saving lives, one lesson at a time. Somewhere, John was sure James was smiling. Lesson: forgiveness is a powerful act that heals both the forgiven and the forgiver. By giving David a second chance, John honored his cousin's legacy of redemption, proving that true justice lies in lifting others up, not tearing them down. The kids under the bridge. David and John himself all found light in the darkness, bound by the belief that no one is beyond saving, and that one act of compassion can ripple outward, changing countless lives.